Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes. We check out great theories, concepts, and discoveries that would really benefit you if you only knew about them. But these are things that have been suppressed, that require great amounts of digging to get into. Digging not only physically, because they've been hidden away, but also digging emotionally and spiritually, because sometimes they attack our, um, you know, the things that we hold dear, and they invalidate many of the things that we hold dear. So this is serious business, but it is still something that you can really greatly benefit from. You just have to get over it. The truth is it's always better to know the truth, or to be at least pointed in that in a more truthful direction. I don't know that we'll ever like uncover the whole truth about anything, but we can kind of um, you know uh, home in on it, get closer and closer, get more and more in the right vector, pointing in the right direction. And in some cases, we are, um, as the band leader Sun Ra would say, we are on the right road, but we're going the wrong direction. And sometimes that's the case. But anyway, um, this is number 401 of the Bible Decode series. And so these are things that your priest, pastor, rabbi, minister don't want you to know. And they won't ask if you, they won't answer if you ask. And they probably will consider you a threat just for asking. And hopefully they don't think that you are possessed by Satan as well. But we have explored aspects of the Roman origins hypothesis throughout these videos. And if that interests you, go back in the archives and just start watching. Maybe start with about number 100. And after I get done with doing the Buddhism, the first Reciprocal Church videos are on the um, Daniel Ingram's book on um, mastering the core teachings of the Buddha. And yeah, I wouldn't really consider Buddhism to be as much of a religion as a science, um, because it's an experiment, and uh, you can recreate the experiment over and over again when you meditate. But after that, we start getting into the Roman origins hypothesis, and that is that the true authors of the New Testament are the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from the late first century, and continuing on really all the way up through many of the popes. And who knows how long this particular psychological operation went. But it was a psychological operation against the Jews. And um, the Jews had been a major pain for the Romans ever since the Romans occupied Judea in 63 BC. So for over a century, it had just been one constant um, uprising, revolution, insurrection, and then it culminated in this war when the Jews, three self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs, and for the Jews, the Messiah was this military commander who was going to help deliver the Jews from their imperial power, from the occupying power, and kick them out of Jerusalem, or kick them out of Judea. And that's exactly what happened in 66 AD. They kicked out the puppet ruler of the Romans named Herod Agrippa II, and he fled back to Rome. So for a fleeting moment, the Jews had regained their beloved capital city there, Jerusalem. I guess it's not the capital per se, or sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but their holy city. And unfortunately, at that point, Emperor Nero sent in the Roman army under General Vespasian, and it literally took the Romans 7 years to defeat the Jews, but defeat them they did, and decimate them they did, especially under Vespasian's son, General Titus, who took control of the reins after Vespasian was made the new Caesar in 69 AD. And Titus presided over the utter destruction of Jerusalem and then eventually the surrender and end of the war, with the last battle being at the fortress of Masada, where, according to the history that was written by Josephus, involved a mass suicide of Jews who decided to kill themselves rather than submit to the Romans. But the main point is that the Romans were hard bitten by this war. It took 7 years and incredible amounts of resources. Both Vespasian and Titus were injured or wounded in the war. Both of them, eventually become the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. And so they want to make sure that this does not happen again. And so they write a story, purely fiction, that is about a Jewish Messiah who is not a military commander, but one who is a Prince of Peace and believes in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar and walking the extra mile, believing that the Roman soldier has the greatest faith in all of Israel. And so, and at the same time, um, being highly critical and doing damage to the Jewish traditions and rituals when he overturns the tables of the Jewish money changers at the temple, and he yells at the um, Jewish merchants selling small animals at the temple, and he tells his Jewish followers to abandon their families in order to follow him. These are blows against the Jews that Jesus is delivering, not against the Romans. Never once does Jesus deliver any blows on the Romans. It's always on the Jews, almost like it was written by the Romans. And then when you go further into the New Testament and you look at the epistles of Paul, so-called, Paul is even more deferential to the Romans and even more critical of the Jews. Something that would just never happen. Another thing that would just never happen is that the Romans had full control. They had full control over publishing, distribution, and censorship within their huge empire. Do you think that a bunch of illiterate fishermen and publicans would be able to publish these stories and get them widely distributed within the empire? Um, and then why are they written in Greek? But these are really just the circumstantial points. The real evidence comes from reading the work of Josephus. Most Christians cite Josephus as a corroborating witness to the existence of Jesus. What they haven't done is actually read Josephus. First of all, to realize that he was not a witness, and he came along 50 or 60 years later. but also that Josephus is known as Flavius Josephus. He is a member of the Roman royal family. He was an adopted member. He lived at Caesar's palace, and his books, War of the Jews, are um, endorsed by the emperors. And when you read War of the Jews, you'll be like, wow, this sounds familiar. What's going on here? Because there are so many parallels, parodies, parables that um, correspond with the Gospels, and especially the book of Luke. Michael Menescot's found over 250 parallels, not just like offhanded parallels, but thick uh, parallels with multiple motifs just in the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter in Luke. That's a thorough saturation, meaning that you pretty much can't read more than a few verses before you encounter another parallel with Josephus. And some of them are just blatant and even um, mocking and ridiculing. You can feel the hatred coming off the paper when you read uh, Josephus and the Gospels combined. And that's just the beginning of the evidence. There's a lot more that I've gone into in hundreds of other videos. Um, the main point for today is that the Romans, when they wrote the Gospels, put together a limited hangout, meaning that they have to make it look like a religion. They have to give you something for you to believe it. They can't just, slap together something and get you to believe it. So there is a lot of very useful, spiritual, and righteous stuff in the New Testament. But all of it is derivative. None of it is original. All of it comes from prior sources, ancient Egyptian sources, ancient Indian, ancient Chinese sources, Greek and Roman uh, religion, philosophy, and mythology, Persian religion and philosophy, uh, mystery schools, alchemy, numerology, astrology. These are all the sources that the Romans used, and they put all of it in there. That's why I think that Josephus maybe wasn't an individual, but was a team of individuals, of intellectuals working for the Caesars and, working at Caesar's palace. But they all kind of put their heads together like a think tank in order to put these gospels together. And then eventually the rest of it, the epistles and Revelation, they were written in a much later period, probably by the sons and daughters of the ones who wrote the Gospels. So we are looking at a book from Kersey Graves that he wrote in 1876 that is called 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christianity. And so this goes over all of these sources that the Romans used to throw into the Gospels, um, different themes and different characters that are reflected in the Gospels. They all have antecedents in much earlier um, myths, religions, and philosophies. And right now, he's going over this kind of obscure chapter that I don't really like too much, but he's talking about the Essenes. And I personally don't believe that the Essenes existed. I think it's almost exactly the same as Jesus. The only corroborating evidence for the Essenes is now the Essenes are supposed to be this very disciplined, pious sect of Jews that Jesus was possibly a member of. And they had a really strict diet, and they didn't really believe in um, marriage and family, and they shared all their money together and so on. But the only people that have ever mentioned the Essenes are all Roman royals, such as Josephus, Philo Judaeus of Alexandria, and Pliny the Younger, who was a very high up um, member of the Roman aristocracy. And Philo was one of the richest men from one of the richest families in the Roman Empire. And he was um, in tight with the royals. He was in a little bit earlier period than these others, however. And so in this chapter, he's kind of quoting um, Philo and Josephus and Pliny, but sometimes he uses Eusebius, who was like an early fourth century church father, who was kind of Constantine's right hand man, um, and so that's not. And he cites this other guy named Ginsburg, who I don't know who he even is. I don't know why he would even cite these people because uh, they weren't before the story of Jesus. Um, and so, but so what he does is he goes over the quotes from uh, about the Essenes and then shows the parallel that's in the scripture. So this is number 14. They would call no man master. And then Matthew 23:8 says, be not called rabbi, for one is your master. Then number 15, they said the Creator made all mankind equal. And in the scriptures it says, God hath made of one blood all them that dwell upon the earth. Number 16. And then sometimes he doesn't even give you the verses that these are coming from or the citations. Um, I get it. It's 1876. It's hard to put all that stuff together. You can't just do it at the touch of a button. They renounced oaths, saying, he who cannot be believed without swearing is condemned already. And in the scriptures it says, swear not at all. Then the Essenes believed that they would not eat anything which had blood in it, or meat which had been offered to idols. Their food was hyssop and bread and salt, and water their only drink. And in Acts 15:29, that ye abstain from meat offered to idols and from blood. And the Essenes believe in taking nothing with them, neither meat nor drink, nor anything necessary for the wants of the body. And in the scriptures it says, take nothing for your journey, neither staves nor scrip, nor neither bread, neither money, neither have two coats apiece. And the Essenes expounded the literal sense of the Holy Scriptures by allegory. And Galatians 4:24 says, which things are an allegory. And the Essenes abjured the pleasures of the body, not desiring mortal offspring, and they renounced marriage, believing it to be detrimental to a holy life. And 1 Corinthians 7:32 goes, it will be recollected that neither Jesus nor Paul ever married, and that they discouraged the marriage relation. Christ says, quote, that they that shall be counted worthy of that world and the resurrection neither marry nor are given in marriage. And Paul says, I guess this is from the 1 Corinthians 7:32. Paul says, the unmarried careth for the things of the Lord. And so the Essenes also strove to disengage their minds entirely from the world. And in the scriptures, it says, if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The Essenes devoted themselves to the Lord. They provided not for future subsistence. And the scriptures say, take no thought for the morrow, what you shall eat and drink, etc. The Essenes regarded the body as a prison. They were ashamed to give it sustenance. And in, I think it's Philippians 3:21. I'm not sure which is Philemon or Philippians. Who shall change our vile bodies? Then the Essenes spent nearly all their time in silent meditation and inward prayer. And in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, or no, Luke 18:1 says men ought always to pray. And in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, it says, pray without ceasing. The Essenes believed the poor were the Lord's favorites. They vowed perpetual chastity and poverty. And in Luke 6:20, blessed be ye poor. James 2:5, hath not God chosen the poor? The Essenes devoted themselves entirely to contemplation in divine things. And in 1 Timothy 4:15 says, meditate upon these divine things. Give thyself wholly to them. And the Essenes fasted often, sometimes tasting food but once in 3 or even 6 days. And in 2 Corinthians 11:27, Christ's disciples were in fastings often. Not so much when Jesus was around, but after. And then the Essenes offered no sacrifices, believing that a serious and devout soul was most acceptable. And in Hebrews 10:18, it says, there is no more offering for sin. The Essenes believed in and practiced baptizing the dead. And 1 Corinthians 15:29 says, else what shall they do which are baptized for the dead? The Essenes gave a mystical sense to the scriptures, disregarding the letter. And in 1 Corinthians 3:6, it says, the letter killeth, but the spirit maketh alive. The Essenes taught by metaphors, symbols, and parables. And in Matthew 13:34, it says, without a parable spake he not unto them. And the Essenes had many mysteries in their religion, which they were sworn to keep secret. And Matthew 13:11 says, great is the mystery of godliness. Oh, no, to you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom. To them it is not given. And then great is the mystery of godliness also. That does not have a citation. And the Essenes had in their churches bishops, elders, deacons, and priests. And Acts 14:23, ordained elders in every church. The Essenes, when assembled together, they would often sing psalms, and Colossians 3:16 says, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms. The Essenes healed and cured the minds and bodies of those who joined them. And Matthew 4:23 says, healing all manner of sickness, etc. The Essenes practiced certain ceremonial purifications by water. And Acts 21:26 says the accomplishment of the days of purification. The Essenes assembled at the Sabbath festivals, clothed in white garments. And Revelation 3:4 says, shall be clothed in white garments. The Essenes disbelieved in the resurrection of the external body. And 1 Corinthians 15:44 says, it is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. But that certainly does go against some other scriptures. So I'm much more amenable to that interpretation, which is more of a Gnostic point of view. Pliny says about the Essenes that they were the only sort of men who lived without money and without women. And 1 Timothy 6:10 says the love of money is the root of all evil. And Christ's disciples traveled without money and without scrip and eschew the lusts of the flesh. The Essenes practiced the extremist charity to the poor. And 1 Corinthians 13:3 says, bestow all thy goods to feed the poor. And the Essenes were skillful in interpreting dreams and in foretelling future events. And Acts 2:17 says, your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams. The Essenes believed in a paradise and in a place of never-ending lamentations. Galatians 8:8, life everlasting. And Matthew 13:41, weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Josephus says that God foreordained all the events. Josephus says that the Essenes affirmed that God foreordained all the events of human life. And 1 Peter says, foreordained before the foundation of the world. All this is really showing me is that, whoever wrote Josephus and whoever wrote Pliny, these are the same people who wrote the New Testament. The Essenes are not relevant to this discussion, but he puts them in here because he's not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis. They made up the Essenes in the exact same way that they made up Jesus. So this is just a kind of a straw man thing here. The Essenes believed in mediators between God and the souls of men. And 1 Timothy 2:5 says, one mediator between God and men. And the Essenes practiced the pantomimic representation of death, burial, and resurrection of God, Christ the Spirit. And 1 Corinthians 15:4 says, with respect to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And the Essenes inculcated the forgiveness of injuries. And Luke 13:34 says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he is talking about the Romans there. Father, forgive the Romans. Not the Jews, but the Romans. And the Essenes totally disapproved of all war. John 18:36 says, "If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight." And the Essenes inculcated obedience to magistrates and to the civil authorities. And Hebrews 13:17 says, "Obey them which have the rule over you." Again, rather convenient for the Romans, right? Um, the Essenes retired within themselves to receive interior revelations of divine truth. And 1 Corinthians 14:26 says, "Every one of you hath a revelation." The Essenes were scrupulous in speaking the truth. And 2 Corinthians 7:14 says, "Speaking all things in truth." The Essenes perform many wonderful miracles. And in the scriptures, it says, many texts teach us that Christ and his apostles did the same. Essenism put all its members upon the same level, forbidding the exercise of authority over one over the other. And Matthew 20:25 and Mark 9:35 both indicate that Christ did the same. Essenism laid the greatest stress on being meek and lowly in spirit. And that is also reflected in Matthew 5:5, Matthew 9:28. The Essenes commended the poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, and the merciful and the pure in heart. And Matthew gives you evidence that Christ did the same. The Essenes commended the peacemakers. And in the scriptures it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." The Essenes declared their disciples must cast out evil spirits and perform miraculous cures as signs and proof of their faith. And Christ's disciples were to cast out devils, heal the sick, and raise the dead as signs and proof of their faith in Mark 16:17. The Essenes sacrificed the lust of the flesh to gain spiritual happiness. And 1 Peter 2:11 says, "You abstain from fleshly lusts." The Essenes, for the Essenes, breaking of bread was a veritable ordinance among the Essenes. And Luke 17:19, Luke 22:19 says, "He took bread, Jesus took bread, and gave thanks and brake it." The Essenes enjoined the loving of enemies. And Jesus did too, love your enemies. And the Essenes enjoined doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Confucian golden rule as taught by Christ. So, this parallel, sorry, I lost my spot here. This parallel might be extended much further, but we will proceed to present the reader with a general description of Essenism, as furnished us by Philo, Josephus, and some Christian writers, also Pliny the Younger. Philo, who was born in Alexandria in 20 BC and lived to 60 AD, and who was himself an Essenian Jew. Don't think so. In his account of them, says, "They do not lay up treasures of gold or silver, but provide themselves only with the necessities of life." Yeah, well, Philo was not any type of Essene. Philo was like one of the richest people, in the empire. So if that's what the Essenes did, Philo was not one of them. Paul, afterwards, having caught the same spirit, advises the same course of life. having food and raiment, therewith be content. Contentment of mind they regarded as the greatest of riches. They make no distinctions, they make no instruments of war. They repudiate every inducement to covetousness. None are held as slaves, but all are free and serve each other. They are instructed in piety and holiness, righteousness, economy, etc. They are guided by a threefold rule: love of God, love of virtue, and love of mankind. Of their love of God, they give innumerable demonstrations, which is found in their constant and unalterable holiness throughout the whole of their lives. Their avoidance of oaths and falsehoods, their firm belief that their God is the source of all good, but of nothing evil. Of their love of virtue, they give proof in their contempt for money, fame, and pleasures, their continence, easy satisfying of their wants, their simplicity, modesty, etc. Their love of man is proved by their benevolence and equality, and their having all things in common, which is beyond all deception. They reverence and take care of the aged as children do their parents. And so a lot of this is from Philo's treatise called Every Virtuous Man is Free. Now, he now goes on to talk about Josephus, and I think this is a much longer section than it needs to be, but it is something that we'll have to get into tomorrow when we return. But I think he's going to tell us that Josephus was also a member of the Essenes, which is not true either, because the Essenes never existed. It's only a property of these Romans. The Romans were the only people that ever discussed the existence of the Essenes, and only three of them: Pliny, Philo, and Josephus. And these were all royals. These people wrote everything, including your New Testament. Nobody was writing anything in the Roman Empire in the first century unless it was backed by the Romans. And so we're going to have to get to get familiar with that general idea. It's psychological operations all the way back through history, not just the 21st and 20th century. It goes all the way back. And all of us are going to have to be prepared to have all our beliefs stripped away. And until we grow up and do that, this movement's going nowhere. We're going to defeat the globalists. But then after that, there's going to be nowhere to proceed. Okay, like, share, subscribe, comment, and contribute. And we'll be back tomorrow to learn about Josephus and the Essenes in Kersey Graves' book, 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christianity, on another of the Bible Decode series on the Wild Tangent Network. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.